everybody. What a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Nancy, for having me. I will start. Let's see, what's my first slide? I don't have to point at the screen, do I? So I grew up in a town in southwestern Connecticut called Easton. It's only about 60 miles from New York City, but it's special because there's part of four drinking water reservoirs, and there's a large amount of open space around the reservoirs. I grew up on a dead-end street. I still live 2 houses away from the house where I grew up, so I have a very strong sense of place. But where the street dead-ended, it dead-ended in this wood. And then if you go further, you encounter these no trespassing signs, which of course to a young kid is like a welcome here sign. And we figured once we were on the other side of the sign, we couldn't read them anyway, so we were safe. And I was introduced to nature by my father, who grew up in Brazil and fell in love with birds as a child in Brazil, and imparted that love of birds to me. And I didn't see any problem crossing this boundary that was imposed. It protected a piece of land, but I saw the deer and the squirrels and the other animals cross the line, so I thought, why can't I? And I spent a lot of time fishing there. So this talk is largely about boundaries that people impose on nature that aren't really there. This is me at about 5 or 6 years old, holding a dead magnolia warbler that had flown into a window of our home and died. I fell in love, I think, first with nature. I preferred nature in books. I loved looking at paintings of John James Audubon and Luis Agassiz Fuertes and field guides. I loved the order and the comfort of seeing nature in this sort of little format that was comforting, you know, with a little picture of something isolated on a white background next to a name. And the whole, you know, enterprise of sort of going out and identifying things was so much fun. You know, you could see something and say, oh, it's a cardinal, and then I know what that is. But then one of the moments that sort of shifted me was seeing this dead bird and actually holding it in my hand and realizing how light it was and almost weightless, and that it had migrated from South America or Central America and made these long journeys like my father had from Brazil. And I started to enjoy nature on its own terms. Nature's not neat and orderly and doesn't fit into a neat box like in field guides, but it's messy and multifarious and constantly changing. And I started to draw things. My most consistent lifelong passion is art and making art, whatever art means, just making things. But drawing in particular is a way that I connect with nature. It's as many of you know, you can have a really intimate experience with a landscape or a thing when you have to sit down and actually look at it and draw it. It's a way of really getting to know something very intimately. And after years of drawing birds, when I was 9 years old, a friend of mine introduced me to fishing. And I started fishing these little streams that go into the reservoirs, and some of them had native brook trout. And I fell in love with these beautiful little fish of cold water streams that looked almost like tropical fish in these small, dark, tannic streams. And I went to the local library looking for a book on the trout of North America, and I couldn't find one. So at 10 years old, I thought, well, I'll make the book on the trout of North America. This is before the internet. There wasn't internet stuff. So I started writing letters, some of them handwritten to departments of wildlife around the country, asking biologists what kind of fish trout lived in these different places. And I got really nice responses from all these people, papers they'd published, photographs. And I started making a list of all the different trout of North America, hoping to do this book. But I realized very quickly that it wasn't that easy to put together a list of all the species of trout of North America, because none of the biologists could agree on how many types there were, or even what a species was. So at 12 years old, I sort of lost faith in the reliability of language and names. And the fundamental problem, first I blamed Carl Linnaeus, but it's not really his fault, because Adam, who I'll get to, was, you know, it's the men's fault mostly, but nature, the fundamental problem as I see it, which I'm writing a book about, is that nature is this fluid, continuous, interconnected, constantly changing thing. But in order to communicate it with language, our most powerful tool, we have to take this beautiful, holistic thing and chop it in little pieces and put labels on them. Labels, you know, get us into a lot of trouble in many ways. in school, being bullied. Language is just very powerful in many ways. Anyhow, but to make a book, I had to go through the practical task of putting a list together. So I sort of just, made it up. And I put this book together. It was published. And then after the book on the trout of North America, I did a book on the trout of Europe and Asia and North Africa. And I stopped worrying about whether it was a species and just started painting fish from particular locations and saying, okay, this is a trout from the headwaters of the Tigris in southeast Turkey near the Iraqi border, and put the geolocation, whatever. This is a trout from Slovenia. This is a trout from Japan. They're just extraordinarily beautiful. Obviously, these are my personal interpretations of these fish. These aren't the fish themselves. That's the beauty of art. It's about nature processed through the human mind. Here's Adam and Eve. I put it in here because I'm talking about naming, and it was in the Bible, it's God's first task for humans is to put names on things. So the writers of the Bible recognized how important and powerful this action was. One of my favorite stories about naming stories is a short fictional piece by Ursula Le Guin, who's one of my favorite writers, and it's called She Unnames Them. And it's about Eve going through the garden, unnaming everything that Adam named. And when she's done, she hands her own name back to Adam and walks out of the garden in protest, which is one of my favorite, also feminist sort of texts. But she felt that the names had put this barrier up between her and the animals, and sort of made it into an us-them scenario, or observer and observed. I like how they're naked, too. Sorry, that's not even relevant. This is, so after years of, maybe it is, I don't know. After years of painting these trout, I started to want to say more about our relationship to nature and to language, so I started painting these hybrids. This is a parrotfish. It became its name in protest of us trying to pin it down with language. This is a turtle dove. And I started doing these murals of bird silhouettes with numbers that reference old field guides where there's silhouettes of birds with numbers that match up to a list of names to help us identify things in the field. So I paint the birds and the numbers, but there's no key, so people get frustrated and can't identify them. This is a mural I did at the Smithsonian American Art Museum on the 100th anniversary of the death of the last passenger pigeon. This is a sculpture I made I call the Myth of Order, and it's about how humans try to fit nature into neat little boxes. We like to, do that. This is a friend of mine named Joe Haynes who caught me fishing illegally in one of the reservoirs. He's a retired game warden, but he introduced me to this wonderful fish called the eel, which is a much sort of maligned fish because it's slimy and people think it's ugly, but it makes some of the greatest migrations of any creature on the planet. It spawns in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, which I'm writing an article for National Geographic about, a beautiful part of the North Atlantic gyre. Unfortunately, a lot of plastic also accumulates there. But then they're born in the ocean, and they migrate up rivers. And of course, they encounter a lot of obstacles like dams. Here's just a map. I make art with eels, too. I put ink on dead eels. I don't kill them myself, but and stamp them on the paper thousands of times to create these abstractions. But here's sort of a physical manifestation of a mental boundary, a dam. Of course, it has a function. This one generates electricity. This is in New Zealand. But when the eels are migrating in the fall down the streams, they go through the penstock tube, which brings the water to the turbines, and they get chopped up. In this case, this is not an optimistic picture, but this is a turbine in New Zealand where the eels actually were coming through in such numbers that they stopped the turbines. And this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is about an exhibition that I worked on about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem that also involved boundaries. The title of the exhibition is called Invisible Boundaries. National Geographic was a partner. Thank you. And anyhow, it was a collaboration between myself and an ecologist named Arthur Middleton and a photographer for Geographic named Joe Reese. And we tried to work across disciplines to tell a story about animal migration in the greater Yellowstone. That was a pronghorn antelope, a picture by Joe Reese that had gotten caught in a fence, another sort of physical manifestation of a boundary. This is Ferdinand Hayden's map of Yellowstone. He was a geologist who drew the rectangle around the region that we call Yellowstone today. But it was a collaboration between Hayden and an artist named Thomas Moran and a photographer named William Henry Jackson that Hayden brought an artist and a photographer on this 1871 expedition to Yellowstone to bring evidence back to Congress to try to help create the first national park in the world. It's a wonderful story. That's a great oversimplification of it, but that's the gist. I first went to Yellowstone in 1979, I guess. I was 4 years old. There I am sitting on my dad's shoulders. The caption says, "James says, what's the big deal?" Castle. So I guess Yellowstone didn't impress me on my first visit. That's my mom doing exactly what you're not supposed to do in Yellowstone. This is a map Arthur created by accumulating satellite data by putting satellite collars on elk. So people knew that animals migrated in and out of the park, of course, but these new technologies are illuminating exactly where the animals go. And this research is ongoing thanks to grants from National Geographic. But you can see these lines coming in and out of Yellowstone are different elk migrations seasonally. They spend the summer in the park and winter outside the park, often in private lands. And Joe captured these, once they knew exactly some of these bottleneck points where the migrations go through canyons, Joe set up camera traps and got these beautiful intimate portraits of individual animals, which I feel is a really excellent way of sort of getting people interested in nature is by saying that, look, this is not every elk is like a cookie cutter elk. In a field guide, you might have one picture of an elk and the name, but that does a great injustice to the diversity of all the elk individuals out there that make their own personal journeys. Imagine if you had a field guide to primates and there was one picture of Homo sapiens. Wouldn't you feel that that was kind of an injustice? That's kind of my little spiel. This is another photograph by Joe. I mean, look at the beauty of this animal hoofing it up a hill after he'd just crossed a river in the fricking winter. I'm almost done. Oh, that's a painting that I did of an elk for the exhibition. So I tried to think, what can I do as an artist that Joe can't do through his photography, or that Arthur can't do through his, did I say photography? Arthur can't, that Joe, yeah, you know what I mean. Anyway, one or two more pictures. This is a large piece that I did that has 700 different silhouettes of animals in the greater Yellowstone. There's birds that migrate to Central America from Yellowstone and to far off places. Yellowstone's connected to the central part of our country through these moths called army cutworm moths that are in their larval stage in Kansas, Nebraska, fly up to the high country and get eaten by grizzly bears. 70% of the diet of grizzly bears are these moths that originate in the plains in the central part of the country. So if people use pesticides and kill the moths, and the grizzlies have to come down to low elevations and eat people. So I made these abstractions with thousands of moths to try to show the abundance of these things, and that's something that would be very difficult for Joe to capture photographically. I think I have one more picture. Sorry, I'm pointing it at. This is sort of exemplifies some of the people have been talking a lot about the boundaries on the edge of a park, you know, and the conflicts that happen between the ranchers and the wilderness inside, the domestic and the wild. But we live in a hybrid landscape today, and we all have to accept that we're part of nature, and we do. And also, you know, I think institutions like the Smithsonian National Geographic are uniquely positioned to help facilitate collaborations across disciplinary boundaries as well, the arts, the sciences, the humanities. I'll stop with this last picture again of the no trespassing sign, which gives me a lot of hope. I remember when this sign was put up about 30 years ago, the old signs used to say no hunting, trapping, or fishing, but there's no more trappers in Fairfield County. But I just love how this sugar maple is growing around the sign. And it just reminds us that we need to be humble and accept that nature will take all our boundaries down eventually. But thank you for having me here.